Just like that, we are live. So we'll welcome everyone who's coming in. We'll give you just a moment to let all the digital participants come in and grab a seat, so to speak, and we will get started. I made the comment last time, I think. What I should have done is had some AI generated theme song or something right now to play while we just take this moment to let people come in. You know, anyone has any good musical talents, now would be the time to let them shine.
Oh my goodness.
I'll spare everybody my attempt at that. So, all right. Well, why don't we'll go ahead and get started. So just for everyone who's coming in, just want to say greetings and welcome to this session of the Generative AI Teaching Conversation webinar series. My name is Sean Leahy, Director of Creative and Emerging Technologies for Enterprise Technology here at ASU, and I'll be your host today. And I'd like to extend a special thank you to the Provost Office for hosting this 30-minute engaging conversation with our expert panelists here from ASU. This is a wonderful opportunity that provides an opportunity for our faculty, our staff, and students to engage in contemporary and emergent discussions around the use of generative AI in higher education. And a note for our audience today, if you have any questions to our panelists, please use the Q&A feature here in Zoom, and we'll save a few minutes at the end to try to address any of those questions. And also would encourage our panelists, again, if you see any questions come in that you want to address right away, please feel free to do that. You can either respond in text or we can address it verbally live as well. And today's topic, again, as you can see, we've got an amazing panel assembled today to help explore this question: what are the aspects of social justice in the generative AI conversation? So clearly a big conversation, a big topic. While we offer no guaranteed solutions in the next 30 minutes, we will do our best to sort of just explore that topic and explore those considerations around social justice and this new sort of emergent wave of AI tools. And to do that, we have an amazing panel assembled here today. So let me go ahead and introduce them briefly. First up, we have Pavan Turaga. Pavan is director and professor in the School of Arts, Media, and Engineering and the School of Electrical, Computer, and Energy Engineering at ASU. Pavan's research spans representational foundations for structured and unstructured data, including time series, image, video, 3D point clouds, and more, and their applications in areas such as interactive systems, machine learning, computer vision, and mobile health. Welcome back, Pavan.
Good to be back, Sean. Thank you.
All right. Yes, excellent. Next up, we have Siddharth Srivastava. Siddharth is an assistant professor of computer science in the School of Computing and Augmented Intelligence at ASU. His research focuses on safe and reliable AI systems that can learn to plan and accomplish complex user-desired tasks. His recent work pioneers the area of user-driven assessment of taskable AI systems. His work on household robotics has received coverage from international news media. He is a recipient of the NSF Career Award, a Best Paper Award at the International Conference on Automated Planning and Scheduling, an Outstanding Dissertation Award at UMass Amherst, and Best Final Year Thesis Award at IIT Kanpur. He served as the conference chair for ICAPS 2019, and he currently serves as an associate editor for the Journal of AI Research. Welcome, Siddharth.
Thank you, Sean. It's great to be here.
Excellent. And of course, we have Retha Hill. Retha is on the faculty of the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communications here at ASU, where she is the executive director of the New Media Innovation and Entrepreneurship Lab. The lab's journalism and computer science majors create innovative products, including virtual, augmented, and mixed reality apps and content, web applications, news game tools, social media tools, and mobile apps for media clients. And on the entrepreneurship side of the lab, students create their own media companies and products. Retha, welcome to the panel.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, I'm excited. And so kind of to set the stage for today, you know, as we've been discussing in this conversation series over the last couple of weeks, we've been exploring the high-level overview of what generative AI tools are, how they're being used. Last week, we explored, for example, how we can foster a positive culture around the use of these tools, and also those considerations associated with issues of academic integrity and things like that. Broadly speaking, generative AI presents the potential for tremendous benefits such as increased productivity, enhanced creativity, and more efficient iterative processes. However, the use of generative AI tools can also pose potential risks or challenges in certain contexts or situations. And one of those areas of serious consideration is that, of course, of social justice. So Pavan, I was hoping I could kind of ask the first question, throw it your way. Could you speak a little bit about this idea or this question of, how can ASU incorporate social justice considerations into the development or the use of different types of AI, especially perhaps generative AI, or thinking about training and data and discrimination and different types of understanding that may be present or not present in how we're already thinking about AI tools?
Thank you, Sean, for the great question. I mean, this is a huge question, clearly, and it's very hard to answer that question from the perspective of what ASU can do directly. But maybe we start with the sources of the problems and the issues and see what ASU can do about them. It's a long-winded story, but I really like going on this spiel. The vast majority of machine learning success that we see today, and of course, generative AI is this the big elephant in the room. But if you go back and see what the origins of this tech were, the origins of this tech were not very different than, let's say, the tech that underlies self-driving vehicles. And that tech has its roots in a way of looking at the world in terms of discrete categories and buckets that don't intersect with each other. As a graduate student, when I was learning my first machine learning class, this was the first statement on day one, which is the world is made of concepts and categories. And in this class, we will learn how to categorize things when we observe something from the world. At that time, I was not that critical, clearly, and I was like, oh, sure, the world is made of categories. We all get it. The world is made of objects. People are men or women. And then there are 6 or 10, races that people recognize. So we all fit in some of these buckets. And the entirety of the machine learning enterprise is to classify things into these buckets that someone decides a priori. And based on some measurements, like a picture, like a fingerprint, like, I don't know, your CV, what have you. So some measurements from the real world, but then the outcomes are always a classification-like problem. Generative AI has its roots in exactly the same tech, the same models that people have used for classification of pictures and objects and animals and cars and vehicles have been, changed into a generative type, but clearly they have the same limitations that these classification models have. If you've never seen a fluid category, you will not be able to generate it. Stuff like that happens. So this notion of thinking about things as belonging to neat categories is the source of the problem, is one of the sources of the problem, a big one, according to me. As an example, ASU has, if you go to your ASU profile on my ASU, you have to choose a gender, plain and simple. It's male or female. And that's the part of the database that ASU is collecting about all of its employees and students. And if you don't identify as one of those, you at this point of time don't have recourse, but you have to choose one of those two. So any database-driven analytics that ASU chooses to put out that uses this is going to amplify things around that choice that has been made by someone who is not thinking about this question too deeply. And these things percolate. We are all living based off of decisions and choices that many people have made for us without our, approval in that sense. And we are fitting ourselves into those buckets because we have no choice. That's one problem. The other is, this is the beginnings. And then the other is, okay, if you do believe, if it is still convenient to think of things as belonging to some buckets, do we have enough representation across those buckets? That's the second problem. And more often than not, we don't. There are some buckets that seem to be overrepresented than others. And that shows up in all kinds of daily things. Racial representation in film and media is very different, is very biased towards, the dominant race in this country. So stuff like that happens. And any databases that we draw from these industries to create any machine learning outcomes tend to be biased. Some people will go even further, a priori data collection. They would say even the act of taking a picture for, let's say, a biometric database, the amount of lighting that people use, even those kinds of decisions, those kinds of guidelines have been made for certain majority buckets to make them look good, and they don't quite work well for other buckets. So we don't know where to begin, but I guess the beginnings are to know that I would say that, hey, the world is not clean buckets, and there are mixed races, there are gender fluid people, there are things that fit between categories. So it's hard to think about those things. It's convenient to break them into buckets. But if you do choose to do that, make sure you have sufficient representation across all these classes. That's the way to think about it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it's in some ways it seems so natural to think about that, right? Like the real world around us is so, I mean, things are it's so non-discrete, right? But then when we think about such data structures, oftentimes it's bucket one or two. Well, what if it's not either of those? Do you choose one and just go, well, okay, but now your data, even from that perspective, right? The data is not accurate or it's skewed in some ways as well. Aretha or Siddharth, what are your thoughts about that? That first question there.
Yeah, so to add to this, in fact, one of the assumptions that's made in typical learning pipelines for them to work is that the world is sort of stationary, that the trends that we saw in the past are still valid. And this is where a lot of the impact of categories changing and shifting and new categories getting added manifests itself. So for instance, if you think of a learning system that's been classifying trends, essentially that's what they do, and they try to use the trend to predict new data. If there was bias in the past, the system is designed to be able to reproduce that trend, and it becomes very difficult to remove that bias while preserving accuracy. So this is something that we see all over the place. And even with generative AI systems, there are already examples where the system was trained on past data. This can be naive, like I'm looking for a restaurant, and it gives me generates some text which says go to this restaurant. The restaurant has closed. So that's a simple example, right? On the other hand, if it has been based on a corpus that's looking at, for instance, text that's or reports, police reports from the past, that which community has been stopped more often in traffic violations and stuff like that, and there was bias in the past, the system is going to try to produce those trends again. That is what we mean by the predictive learning capability. So those biases creep in that way, and it's very hard to remove them. There are ways to do it. For instance, look at the training data, see if it's diverse, see if it's well represented, and so on, and keep track of how things are changing. But this means that we cannot just take a system, box it up, and use it forever. There has to be some end-to-end safety wrapper around it at the very least.
Yeah. And what I would add is, I echo what Pavan talked about, and it's not that these companies that are creating these new systems that they don't know about this bias, and people have been pointing it out now for years. You can go back to 2015, 2018, where Black and other aware scientists pointed out a lot of the problems and additional problems that could come from the bias that's embedded in how these systems were created. And I don't see that much has been done about it. And to Pavan's point, where do you start? You have to go back to the beginning. Do you bring in some additional sources to train these models? Do you start again? Do you try to, pull together a diverse group of scientists and other people to say, hey, let's stop for a moment and figure out how we can correct this? Because you're right, it's going to continue to build on itself. And it can be dangerous too. If you think about facial recognition software, for example, and just how wrong, we're talking about double-digit, error rates for some of the facial recognition software that big companies like Microsoft and Amazon and others are selling to police departments, and what could happen when you get that wrong. When you're talking about 21% and 30%, those are huge numbers, and it has implications for people who could be picked up by the police and jailed for something they didn't do because the program recognized you as the suspect. Or if you push back and say, hey, wait a minute, I'm innocent, I didn't do anything, it could result in your death. I mean, so there are a lot of implications, not to be overly dramatic, but it's more than just an inconvenience that when you're looking for pictures of a beautiful woman, it's 99% going to come up white instead of any other color. But it's also can have implications when it comes to social justice and policing in community. So we've got to sort of try to get this right. And I think an institution like ASU and others can continuously raise that issue, bring in more people to the table from different communities who can point these things out and maybe help, push the industry to take this seriously and try to pull out some of those biases. It may be too late, but I'm an optimist.
Well, Aretha, I share your optimism. I would say it's never too late, especially, as things, I think we are in many ways, right? We're in this, especially when it comes to some of the generative AI tools. We are in a stage right now where I think there's probably a lot of opportunity, hopefully, a lot of opportunity for change because again, we've talked before. I mean, even in this particular series, but also lots of conversations elsewhere. I mean, so often is the case where the technology innovation or disruption outpaces policy, regulatory frameworks, things like that. And so there's always, throughout history, right, we do have this sort of, and not to say that it's always history's gotten it right either, but that from a technological change perspective, that there's usually this, this period of time that exists when these new technologies are available, but there's hasn't been really any policies or consideration around them. So we're sort of figuring out how these things use. And I think during that time, that's when we have some of the most, I would say that's where I'm the most optimistic that we have the most time to affect change in how those things are used and stuff. But I think this also sort of bridges nicely to this other question. And Siddharth, I'll ask you to sort of take a first attempt here at trying to try to answer this question. But as we think about this idea of social justice, right, that these the social justice aspect anyway is crucial for ensuring that as we use these technologies, that we try to use them in a fair, equitable, and inclusive way for all, right? And Retha, you did a nice job of identifying and articulating some of those current lived and past lived challenges with these things, of these biases, of these elements that have been sort of baked into these technologies. But from your perspective, leaning not only just here at ASU, but also just your professional background working with AI systems and things like that, how can we work to recognize and address these issues of potential bias or discrimination in these tools? Like how do we, if we know the answer is we need to do better in many ways, what are some ways, or how do we think about starting to tackle that?
Yeah, very small problem, right?
No
Yeah,
pressure to solve it right
no
now,
pressure.
but the world is watching.
Right. Well, Sean, part of the solution is exactly what you're doing. So, as an educational institution, one of the things that we can do is increase awareness among consumers and sort of increase the expectation that we have from such technology. And the reason is because with AI systems, there's a fundamentally new kind of application or a system that we're developing. So for instance, if you think about the previous examples of high-tech stuff that we had, cars, or, let's say your televisions or whatever, it was somehow easy to assess these kind of systems and to provide some sort of guarantees, right? So for instance, when you press the brake, the car is going to slow down, and you have some sort of an expectation built around how the system is going to respond or how it's going to behave when you give it a certain prompt, in some sense, give it a certain input. But with AI systems, these two things break down. In some sense, now we are generating technology that is, first of all, not limited in functionality. If you take a system like a generative AI system, you could use it to create code. People have used it to create games when they didn't actually know how to code, right? People have also used it to generate offensive text. So the thing is, how do we now analyze this kind of a system? What kind of functionality assessment can we do? So one of these problems is the broad functionality. The other is the system adapts, right? So if it is a good system, then, to address some of these bias concerns, on the one hand, we want it to continually adapt to the new situation. We don't want to be biased. We don't want to repeat that trend. You have to do something new. So we want it to adapt. On the other hand, now it is much harder to assess safety or provide any kind of a guarantee if the system is adapting to its user. So in some sense, part of the research question here is, how do we enable users to effectively assess this new technology? I want it to write some text for me, let's say. How do I assess whether this is going to introduce some bias? How do I assess that it's going to be safe? And to some extent, we've reached a situation where we expect the software system to be buggy, right? So it puts lesser pressure on companies to roll out stuff because people expect that this is going to be better. So we need to address that expectation to some extent. And I think as an educational institution, this is one of the key things we can do. We can improve awareness among people that, okay, this is a system that is basically auto-completing stuff, right? There's no notion of truth that it is preserving. Even when you say that restrict yourself to Wikipedia and produce an answer, it's just auto-completing. It's trying to guess what you want and generating that stuff. So many times it turns out that this is correct, and that's quite impressive, right? But at the end of the day, it is just completing stuff, and we cannot expect it to be correct. So that is a case where we don't expect a certain guarantee, but we sort of assume, and you see lots of examples where people just do what the thing says and run into trouble. So, so to make this a little more concrete, there are two examples of things that could be done here. So I, for instance, teach the AI class at the undergrad and grad level in ASU. And one of the things that I teach my students to do is always question the assumptions and guarantees that are being provided by the system. Under what conditions does it work? So stationarity, and those are one of those things. And the other thing is to make it more clear that what are we expecting the system provides in terms of a safety guarantee, and how can we use it? Right. And it turns out very often you don't have these guarantees. So the user has to be an expert. So when you use a generative AI system right now, the best cases are where an expert is using it to complement their current skills. So for instance, you might be a designer for spaceship parts, and you're expected to design something new, and you can test it. So you need that kind of a thing. The second example is, for instance, there are already machine learning systems that are deployed in risk-sensitive situations. So for instance, you have an X-ray classification system that looks at chest X-rays and lets doctors figure out whether or not they need to look at this particular X-ray. It flags it. And what is less known is, along with that system, you get a bunch of fine print, which says that with every new deployment, you have to sort of calibrate the system again. Right? So these kind of things are there. This was a high-risk system, so FDA approved it, and FDA has placed these requirements. We need more of that. We need the consumers to realize that they need to have some expectation of correctness or accuracy or safety with these things. And if the system is not coming with this by default, they shouldn't trust it for an end-to-end pipeline. So these are some of the steps we could take along that way, but of course, there's a lot of open questions here.
Yeah, absolutely. Pavan or Aretha, I'm curious what your thoughts around this would be.
I mean, I think it also intersects with one of the chat questions, which is, how does this intersect with curriculum? Because it impacts everything, right? It's not just a computing problem. It's not just a math stat problem. I mean, my encouragement would be like who was asking that question, that anonymous question, is absolutely right. There has to be an AI/ML version of the class in each department. For example, we have a class called Machine Learning for Media Arts, plain and simple. And I teach it with one of my music faculty, Todd Ingalls. We don't teach theory. We don't start with the foundations of how you build ML systems, but we touch upon enough concepts that you know how it works, but then we apply it to media content creation. So it's all about generative AI in some form or another: music creation, game creation, visual art. And we do ask people to poke the limits of the system, like, do the usual things that everybody does, be impressed the first day, but push it, see where it starts breaking down. And it's not hard to find those breakpoints. And they all come down to this question of, oh, it doesn't know this concept. Why does it not know this concept? Because you backtrack to the training sets and the concept didn't exist in the training set. So stuff like that happens all the time. I would say that would be a good beginning. Have a class on machine learning for narrative storytelling. Use ChatGPT for that and have that in the journalism school, maybe some version in the film and theater school. I mean, every department can have a class that introduces ML to them in the context that makes sense for them, and explore the possibilities and limits of the systems. That would be a good beginning, I think. Yeah.
And to jump in, I'm part of the Provost Generative AI Committee that's kind of pondering some of these things, and we were talking about what could we do immediately, maybe even this summer. And one of the ideas that came out of the discussion is to provide a grant or something to various schools to try to come up with that type of class. If you don't have that type of class now, what can we do to sort of test, to probe, to think about these issues as they apply to the various disciplines? So in journalism, for example, we just in reporting, what is generative AI? How is that different from, what Siddharth was talking about some years ago? Also, what's the difference between narrow AI and general AI? Will GPT-4 and subsequent versions take over the world? Because journalists tend to be, as we have an old joke, how do you count 1, 2 trend? And right now we're in the, oh my God, the world is falling phase. Or people are like really impressed that these systems can create songs and poems and so on and so forth. But we have to start thinking about the impact in society and how journalists can cover that and give people correct information, and not the sky is falling versus, oh, I'm so impressed that it figured out a recipe for me type of thing. So we have to start thinking about, for every school here at ASU, what type of class should we be thinking about developing so that we can introduce these concepts to our students?
Yeah, excuse me. And so, Aretha, I think this works nicely. And I just want to give credit to whoever left this this comment in the Q&A. Just to paraphrase it in case anyone, I'll read it aloud too, because I don't know when these are recorded if they capture any of the things in the print. But the question I'll paraphrase was essentially, social justice issues related to AI impact all disciplines. And so raising this question of, do you think that should be included in the curriculum? And to Bhavan's point, right? You had, I think last time you had talked about that too, like AI for fill in the blank, right? And, Retha, to your point, I think, maybe just kind of, I'll ask you maybe to dig a little bit more here, kind of, because I think this question nicely relates here to sort of our last point for this session, is thinking about, how do we incorporate diverse perspectives and promote transparency and accountability when we're talking about all of these systems? And like, from your perspective, I'd be curious too, and, to everybody else, right? While these changes and developments in AI are not necessarily new, what is new is that it's caught the public's attention, right? That this is a breakfast or lunch or dinner time conversation with pretty much anybody that you kind of run into. So also kind of thinking about that in terms of, these issues of bringing in, incorporating diverse perspectives and transparency and accountability. Is there anything new or novel about this particular technological innovation and change versus things that have happened in the past, for example? I'm curious to where your thought process, where are you thinking about that?
Well, I think the good news is, unlike even when the internet or the web first became a thing back in the mid 1990s, and I was around back then creating the first WashingtonPost.com, we have a lot more diverse students and scholars and researchers and people who can speak up and have impact on how these systems are being developed. That's the great news. We have a lot of high school students of all, both genders, all genders, different ethnicities who are interested in this type of thing. We should be looking for those students at ASU who want to work on these issues and think about these issues. We have critical mass. We're at Hispanic serving institutions. There are HBCUs. There are people and institutions all across the country that we can bring that critical mass of thinkers that maybe we didn't have back in the 60s or 70s. Except for a few outstanding people who were working in the technology space. So we have the people, we just have to have the will. And I think about, all disciplines, even within the arts, for example. I create a lot of immersive media projects, and one of the big issues I have is if you're looking for assets, avatars to use, it's very difficult to find avatars of regular looking diverse people. So having people with the training to create items in Blender or Maya or any of those where they're thinking about the diversity of our country and humanity and who can create those assets. Or even within some of these text to art generation, I see the problems all the time, that they have a really difficult time creating realistic versions of African Americans, especially if you're using realistic versus a fantasy thing. They seem to do okay with fantasy, but for realistic, the faces are distorted, the hair, the body types are completely distorted. And I'm hoping that people with archives, Black newspapers, Ebony magazine, all these African-American photos and other archives that are out there, that we can use those to help train these large language models so that we can have more photos and information to draw on, so it can be more diverse. Because it's really frustrating sometimes. I did one recently just trying to get some images of African-American soldiers from the 1940s. And it was apparent to me that they were using models of African soldiers to give me what I was looking for, because the helmets were different from World War II. There was the safari type of helmet or the really high garrison caps, and that's not how our soldiers in the 1940s were dressed. But if you look at Nigerian and North African soldiers, they did wear that. So it's like, where are all these photos of African-American soldiers in the 40s and 50s? I know we have them. I've seen them, but they're not making their way into the training. And we need to make sure that we're encouraging all types of people to jump into this and not be afraid of it, that help make it right. And we can start here at ASU.
Yeah, excellent. And I want to give Pavan and Siddharth a chance to chime in or submit any last comments, because I'm also looking at the time, and the 30 minutes has gone by like a snap, which is insane. But yeah, before we kind of wrap up, I would just open the floor, to Siddharth and Pavan, if you want to sort of either comment on that or provide any other sort of closing comments about this topic.
Yeah, I don't have much to add, but I'm going to pass on a question to Siddharth, see if he can answer that. Like the question that Sean asked, is this any different than past, successors in AI? I feel this is a bit different, because the classic textbook, metrics and thresholds, when people, start thinking about AI as a real thing, like the Turing test. And, even in the context of image generation, it's less well known, but there was a very famous mathematician, Ulf Grenander, who in the 80s was thinking about generative stuff. And he wrote in one of his books that something visually if you can generate it, if you can draw it. He was mentioning that in the context of algorithmic generation. And this was in the 80s, when you could only generate little bitmaps and, little sketches, and that was considered good enough. But now the time is there where you can generate pretty interesting looking visual representations of common objects. I wouldn't say of everything, common objects. And the Turing test, can you converse with an AI agent and be fooled into thinking it's a human behind the scenes? We are nearly there. So with that, I'm just going to pass on the question to Siddharth, because these are fundamental computer science definitions of when you expect AI to be functioning. So what's the latest on that, Siddharth? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a great question. I think we could talk about talk for hours on this. But one thing is that all of these questions, they reveal this bias that we have as humans, that we correlate well-written text with other abilities that a person would have, because we simply didn't have an example of, let's say, a 2-year-old writing paragraphs and paragraphs of syntactically correct, grammatically well-formed text. But that is what these systems do. And so that correlation is no longer valid. And it's very hard to wrap your head around that. These are systems with, if you imagine the sphere of human capability, these are systems that have like one narrow spike going out. So for instance, if you see AlphaGo, the system that defeated the human champion in Go, it had one narrow capability, and that was on Go. Although it was superhuman, that term is not really valid. It was really good at playing that, and it had millions of training samples from that. It was good at it. Similarly, this text generation system is actually not doing any kind of truth assessment or semantic assessment. It's just completing your text, right? So its expertise is narrow there. And, so I really like your question, because it also reveals that people who came up with these definitions, for instance, the Turing test, Turing didn't imagine that at some point you would have a system that would do just that. It can't reason, it can't add, it can't subtract, it can't walk. It doesn't have any of those things. can't respond to your emotions like a human would, but can still generate good text.
Yes.
Right.
Awesome.
So in some sense, we have to break that correlation now.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Siddharth, thank you for ending us sort of on that open question and open prompt, and just, yes, Pavan, Rita, Siddharth, thank you so much for joining me today and talking about such a heavy, complex, but yet just absolutely imperative and important question around social justice and how we incorporate new technologies and as we work through those as a community. I think absolutely just, and like I said, an imperative topic to have, and what a wonderful panel to assemble here today to discuss those. So thank you for joining me and spending your time with us today. And I just want to give a shout out to our audience, on behalf of myself and the entire expert panel with us today. Thank you for joining us on this generative AI teaching conversation. Special thank you to Sarah Elliott, who's in the Zoom room, pushing all the buttons and making sure everything works the way it's supposed to behind the scenes. We hope you've enjoyed our time with us today. And if you're interested in learning more, please check the events calendar. You can also catch pre-recorded videos from other webinar series there as well. So thanks again from all of us, and I hope you have a wonderful day wherever that is for you. And until next time, thank you all very much.